His most famous novel, Fatelessness, follows the story of a Hungarian teenager, György George, uh, or maybe Gorge, I don't know how to pronounce this, Kovács, witnessing his family's deportation to Auschwitz, then 2 weeks later losing his freedom, finding himself sent to the same concentration camp. Written in a bleak, matter of fact tone, with the protagonist drifting through the events rather than actively interpreting them, the novel documents the boy's life in the camp and the vacuum he finds upon returning to those who have never left. Although some elements of Fatelessness can be interpreted as autobiographical, Kertesz Imre Kertesz clearly distances himself from the narrator. This is very important, and this is why I wanted to read this. Kertesz clearly distances himself from the narrator, stating that the simple wording of his novel is an artistic choice rather than the direct result of recalling his own teenage memories. And this is why I wanted to read this. The relevance of Fatelessness can be seen through this unique and bold linguistic approach in describing the life in concentration camps through a tight, distancing objectivity, but with an unexpected touch of openness, irony, and humor to it. The style draws from the realization Kertesz made as an adult that living in dictatorships deprives people from a more complex thinking and leaves only this childish language to express oneself. And I think that this is a very, very important point that is being discussed here. The semi-autobiographical nature of that voice that a writer employs or invents or devices to narrate the story, that semi-autobiographical voice about, say, the protagonist or whosoever, the narrator, that seems to be close or closer to the life of the novelist himself or herself. Even that voice is always semi-autobiographical. It is created, it's an artistic creation, because otherwise, it would be very, very different. Exactly, different is the word, because the narrator that we create is it's another person. And I think that this is such an important point, my dear friends. I just read an article from June 2020 on Hungarian Nobel Prize winner Imre Kertesz. This has been published on some website about this writer, a Hungarian Nobel winner, and I thought that this analysis was just so clear and so helpful in deciphering even modern literature of all languages today, that it should be really very vital and widely accepted that that semi-autobiographical thing is very important. So I want to share that, but I think that I will just continue reading a little bit, and there are more articles, and I will that is why I was dithering and pausing, and I'll pull out more and I will read more from other articles where he clearly talks about his semi-autobiographical voice. So here is more on living and writing the same novel. Following Fatelessness, the novels of Kertesz explore the connections between language, memory, and identity, trying to incorporate experiences of the survivor as well as the guilt that comes with it to forge them into a personal destiny. Kaddish for an Unborn Child, 1990, and Fiasco, 1988, are often read in a trilogy with fatelessness, while Kertesz is a furious monologue against the thought of bringing a child into a world that enabled the Holocaust. Fiasco revisits Kovash, now a young adult, returning to Hungary after the Stalinist government has taken over. The short novel The Path Seeker examines how memories of the past can be conversed and their implications on the remembrance of the Holocaust, while Detective Story, a Kafkaesque prison confession, explores how all oppressive regimes have similarities between them. And of course, it is very tempting, and indeed it should be read. It's very tempting and prescribable as well to read his Nobel lecture, and you will see how interesting it is, because it talks about very simple and basic and fundamental questions like why do we write, who do we write for, and it begins with a very interesting paragraph about being watched, this feeling of being watched. It can be taken lightly in a sense there, but he has talked about, and then he goes on to talk about dictatorships, this and that, and we know that he's also talking about all eyes are on him, and they are going to listen to him as to what he is going to say about his writing and everything, his literary journey, which has been a grand one. Apart from it, it also hints at all the surveillance mechanism that we know that the Stasi did, all the regimes have done, and much has been said about states, and it can be said about India. Name it, and people have done it and are doing it, so it's not over. No brutality ever is ending, it seems. Modernity seems to be a very trying time in itself, so we will also read that, but I just wish to read a little more from this same article. Continuously exploring memory and identity by merging the roles of writer, narrator, character, novel, and life, Kertesz eventually comes to a conclusion that memory is impossible to transmit. As soon as he writes them down, they cease to exist as his own personal history and become part of an artistically curated archive. His style, cynical, avoiding pathos and self-pity, yet full of humor, shows the reader the moral he lived and wrote by. In Kertesz's world, the ideal person is someone who creates and recreates themselves freely and endlessly, never giving in to defining themselves through ideology. Thank you so very much for listening, my friends.